Great. Thank you for that introduction. So my presentation today is Compromise or the Common Good, What Goes First? My introduction. The founding fathers of the United States were influenced to various avenues by the natural law tradition, traced back to Aquinas' work in the 1200s, which itself was based on the work of Aristotle. Natural law thinking was worked into the Constitution of the United States and became an important element in American jurisprudence. The key feature of the natural law tradition this paper will focus on is the concept of the common good. Indeed, one finds numerous references to the common good as justification in the development of new laws and public policies in the United States. However, there has been a clear shift in the way that the concept of the common good is used in American politics today, and indeed on the global stage, that has moved away from the traditional understanding of the common good, for example, as still employed in the social thought and moral teaching of the Catholic Church, to usage that reflects a utilitarian notion of the greater good, which requires parties to compromise in order to achieve solutions amongst groups in society with opposing viewpoints. Indeed, today the public and political pressure to compromise is stronger than ever and continues to grow under the powerful influence of political correctness. However, it will be argued that the only way to ensure a genuine common good, understood in the traditional sense, is through consensus. The rich meaning of consensus will be explored, clarifying how consensus differs in important ways from compromise. This paper will then argue why countries living by democratic ideals ought to use this approach in the development of laws and public policy. So my first section is the tradition of the common good. The traditional understanding holds that the common good is an integral part of the human person's moral, social, and spiritual life. In its simplest form, the concept is derived from Aristotle's maxim that the good of the whole is superior to the good of the part. This is because a part cannot exist without the whole. Thus, in political society, the good of an individual is inferior to the good of the community because the individual depends upon the community. However, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle does note that while the good of the community is higher and more noble, it includes the good of the individual. In short, personal good is connected to the common good. This concept of the common good was further developed by the scholastics, most notably in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. Drawing upon the basic concept of a common political good in Aristotle, St. Thomas expanded the notion of the common good beyond politics to include the moral and spiritual levels of human life. For Aquinas, God, as the supreme good in reality, represents an objective good that is external to individual things in creation. All human action is directed towards attaining this common, external, absolute end. In terms of our shared political life, human beings should all work towards this ultimate good together in community. Building on these foundations, Francesco de Vitoria, the great Spanish Dominican and influencer of modern international law, made frequent appeal to the notion of a common good of humanity, emphasizing that since God is the supreme good of the universe, the common good would then naturally apply beyond individual political communities to the whole world. That is, Vitoria offers a global perspective on the common good. In more recent years, much work has been done to further articulate the concept of the common good and how it can apply to human political life. To summarize, the traditional view would hold, as stated in number 1906 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, quote, by common good is to be understood the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The common good concerns the life of all. It calls for prudence from each and even more from those who exercise the office of authority, end quote. As such, the common good, as expressed by Jacques Maritain, quote, is the good human life of the multitude, of a multitude of persons. It is their communion in good living. It is therefore common to both the whole and the parts into which it flows back, and which in turn must benefit from it, end quote. My next section will discuss this shift in meaning to the greater good. However, as already noted, this traditional understanding of the common good as a good that all persons share in has now shifted in common usage. Instead, today, when this phrase is used in political discourse, it is most commonly applied in a utilitarian manner. For example, in the essay, The Common Good Under Fire, Emmert uses a definition of the common good from Wikipedia, which says, quote, the common good is often regarded as a utilitarian ideal, thus representing the greatest possible good for the greatest possible number of individuals, end quote. There are two important points to note here. First, that the commonly used online tool, Wikipedia, not normally considered the most reliable source by scholars, states a definition of the common good that is clearly not in keeping with the traditional view elaborated above. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, that a scholarly article would cite and use this definition, a sign that the common parlance is becoming accepted as the correct understanding of the common good. Further, if one pays close attention to public and political discourse, it becomes clear that politicians and pundits are leaning towards an understanding of a majority good as representing the common good. Indeed, in a pluralistic society in which it would seem a practical impossibility to get total agreement on most, if any, issues, it is not surprising that common would begin to get associated with the majority opinion of an issue, as that view represents what most people would want. But this is where the importance of the concepts, if not the actual words themselves, becomes clear. The danger of the utilitarian perspective, as has been pointed out by many critics of the ethical approach, is that the greater good or majority view always results in a minority who, in the name of pluralism and working together, must sacrifice their values and beliefs in what is good in order to satisfy the majority of society. Now, it can be debated whether this greater good approach is better suited to political life in a pluralistic society than the traditional concept of the common good laid out earlier. But the two should not be equated. It is clear that when the greater good approach creates a minority that must sacrifice their values and beliefs for the majority, the good created here is not truly common and does not truly flow back upon everyone in society. In point of fact, the minority does not benefit and are called upon in the name of the greater good to bear the loss of their values and beliefs. However, through the rhetorical move of co-opting the phrase common good in such cases, the impression can be given that even such a personal compromise really is good because it helps us live together in our pluralistic society. but this impression is false. Nevertheless, those that reduce the common good to the simple utilitarian ideal of promoting the good of the majority argue more and more strongly that this can only be achieved through compromise, including compromise of deeply held moral and religious beliefs by some in the body politic. So my next section is titled Compromise versus Consensus. The term compromise can have different meanings. In common usage, people will say that a compromise involves each side in a dispute giving up something they want in order to find a middle ground. For example, if one political party in a country thinks we should spend more tax dollars on education than on the military, but another party thinks we cannot cut the military defense too much, they might come to a compromise that makes sure both education and military get money, just not as much as each side would prefer. Or on a smaller scale, two people who disagree on what type of restaurant to go to might compromise and go to a buffet that would provide many different types of food to eat. In both cases, neither side gets exactly what they want, but both get some satisfaction. Again, in common usage, this is what most people think of when they hear the word compromise. However, this is an inadequate understanding of what the term compromise actually entails. Consider the word itself. The English term comes from the Latin word compromisum, which literally means mutual promise, as understood by extension as an agreement to accept an arbiter's decision on a point of difference. But later usage then included a notion of exposing oneself to risk or danger, or more directly, a weakening of one's reputation because of the compromise that was granted. It is this later usage that relates to the notion of something becoming weakened when compromised, such as the foundation of a house being compromised by an earthquake. The notion of being weakened by a compromise is important here, as it embodies the actual conceptual point at issue. In a genuine compromise, a person does not just concede or give up on any simple point of what they desire. No. A genuine compromise requires that a person give up something they hold as a core value or belief. In this light, the earlier examples would not represent actual compromises because neither side had to give up anything. In the one case, the two political rivals still walk away from the table getting something from their deal, and neither side had to betray their value. Nothing has been weakened or compromised in their positions. In the other case, both people still get to eat. So again, nothing is weakened in that arrangement. Instead, a genuine compromise would involve cases being debated in many countries, such as those related to the provision of abortion. For example, here in the United States of America, those in favor of abortion want it to be legal all the way through pregnancy. Pro-abortion advocates further argue that these abortions should be paid for by the government as a means of promoting women's rights. And more recently, that doctors should be required to provide them, regardless of personal moral beliefs. Those who oppose abortion argue that it is never morally acceptable because it ends an innocent human life. And so there are often calls in the political arena to come to some type of compromise on this issue, with both sides giving up something to find a middle ground. This typically takes the form of the pro-abortion side offering to restrict abortion after a certain point, such as viability. It is argued that those who oppose abortion should then compromise here and accept this limit because it will save at least some innocent lives by restricting abortion after the limit. However, there are two key problems with this understanding of compromise. First, note that in the abortion example, both sides do not really compromise their values and beliefs, and therefore, this is not fair or equal. Those who oppose abortion, of course, do give up a core value. Believing that abortion kills an innocent human life, this side is asked to weaken their moral stance by allowing and not opposing the act of abortion prior to the agreed upon limit. To willingly accept this, even in the effort to save some lives after the limit, violates the moral consciences of people in this group, and thereby weakens both character and integrity. However, the limit agreed upon in this case does not have the same impact on the pro-abortion side because they achieve their goal of having abortion legally available. In this case, something is given up, but only in the technical sense of when an abortion can be procured. The moral stance of this group is not weakened or compromised in the same manner as those being asked to violate their moral beliefs by allowing abortion in the first place. Second, ethics does not require us to compromise our values and beliefs. Therefore, no one should demand that we do so. It is worth noting that what we are really focused on here are not personal preferences or even different practical judgments about how to achieve certain goals in society. Rather, the matters under consideration here are judgments of conscience, which must never be taken lightly in any society that professes democratic ideals and in which all members are viewed as equals. The proper use of conscience involves a serious twofold responsibility. On the one hand, agents always have a moral obligation to properly inform their conscience. But on the other, once formed, agents always have a moral obligation to obey their conscience. And while it is true that people can and do indeed sometimes make mistakes in forming their conscience, the personal responsibility involved here requires that we respect individual decisions of conscience. And when these decisions seem wrong, our common task is to work in mutual respect as we seek the truth together. In this light, Christopher Kaczor has argued that forcing another person to violate their conscience is wrong because, quote, it is wrong to force another person to do anything. For in doing so, one makes the other person into simply a means to achieve one's own plans, as if that person were a tool or a slave. But he further observes, continuing the quote, none of us want someone to force us to act against our consciences, so we should accord the same respect to others. Forcing someone to act against his or her conscience is not treating the person in accordance with respect for the dignity of that person. Until recent years, the ideas just expressed were considered uncontroversial in a country like the United States. Living in a pluralistic society, it would be obvious that people will hold different views, and mutual respect required that we not force others to violate their deeply held values and beliefs. Indeed, tolerance for our differences was considered the only just way to live together. But how can we resolve the many political and moral disputes that we face in our world today if we do not invoke compromise? Here's where we need to turn to the concept of consensus. Consensus, from the same Latin word, simply means agreement. It is further derived from the verb consentiere, which means to feel together. It is important to add this aspect of togetherness because that is the crucial conceptual difference between consensus and the earlier discussion of compromise, in which one group is being asked to sacrifice in the name of the greater good. So, what is consensus? It helps to begin by emphasizing what consensus is not. First, consensus is not 100% agreement or unanimity. Given the many differences between human beings, outside of very small groups, it may never be possible to get 100% agreement on any issue. Fortunately, this is not necessary to achieve consensus. Further, consensus is not the same as compromise, as has been discussed here. Instead, consensus is achieved when all parties in a dispute can accept and live with the decision. As such, consensus will specifically respect each person's conscience, integrity, and character. The decision reached may not be everyone's top choice or preference, but it is one that all parties can accept and recognize as good. This is important because, as was noted, ethics does not require us to sacrifice or violate our conscience. As an example, consider a patient speaking with doctors about how to treat a cancerous tumor. A surgeon will typically recommend surgery to remove the tumor, while a radiologist would recommend radiation to shrink the tumor, and an oncologist would recommend chemotherapy. All three are medically appropriate ways to treat cancer. However, if scans indicate the tumor is fibrous and spread out in a patient's tissue, as opposed to a solid mass, surgery would be more difficult and would require taking out a lot of the surrounding tissue in order to make sure to remove the whole tumor. Such a tumor would also be a challenge for radiation to target easily. Instead, such a tumor would respond best to chemotherapy, even if only initially to reduce its size to give surgery or radiation a better chance of success later. In trying to help the patient, all three doctors could come to a consensus on this point because all of these treatment options are good. And that is a key point here. Consensus is achieved by focusing on various options that can all be objectively recognized as good. Thus, working towards consensus will promote just resolutions to disagreements and not compromise or weaken one or both parties in a dispute. Based on this understanding, the initial examples given of politicians debating how to spend tax dollars or friends deciding where to have a meal together represent instances of consensus rather than compromise. The agreements arise from working together to achieve something good. Indeed, as one considers this, it should become clear that the great majority of decisions we make that involve other people are really instances of consensus. My conclusion. In response to the question of this presentation, compromise never leads to a genuine common good. In a pluralistic society that professes to accept democratic ideals, including mutual respect for all of its members, the only just recourse for addressing differences is through consensus, or arriving at decisions that everyone in society can accept and live with in light of personal values and beliefs. How far to extend these points is a matter of further discussion, but at a minimum, the following conclusions can be drawn. First, given the important responsibility placed on each member of a society to form personal conscience, society as a whole must respect individual conscience if it wants to embody democratic ideals and equal treatment of all. Second, A hallmark of respecting individual conscience is not forcing a person to violate their duly formed conscience, even indirectly. Third, this would mean that on disputed issues, members of society must never be asked to compromise their values and beliefs in the manner discussed here. That is, people must not be forced to weaken their character and integrity on matters of conscience. And finally, this would mean in a democratic society that truly values all of its members, the only just approach for making decisions, public policies, and laws is through consensus building, in which each person can accept and live with the outcomes, even though such outcomes might not be, and often will not be, every person's top choice or preference. Returning to the current situation in the United States, this would mean in practice that while making actions such as abortion, same-sex marriage legal through voting, where majority rules may be accepted at a political level, forcing members who object to these actions on moral grounds to make these possible either directly, as in the cases mentioned where some want to force doctors to perform abortions, for example, or indirectly, as is more often the case through using tax dollars to pay for them, is unjust. Any so-called greater good achieved through these coercive policies would not create a common good that everyone in America would genuinely share. In a fair and democratic society, open discussion on such issues, something often lacking today due to political correctness and cancel culture, must be allowed so that all members of society can be heard as we come together and work towards consensus on these important issues. Such a process will, of course, take time, but consensus building is the only way to honor the ideals of democracy and treat all members of society equally. And thank you.